Hey gang, welcome back to the Silver River Art Studio. Today I'm going to teach you the purl stitch in knitting, and we're going to use it combined with the knit stitch to make this fantastic toasty warm knit headband. The purl stitch is actually the reverse of the knit stitch, so if this is your first foray into knitting, hop on over to my tutorial on learning to knit to master the knit stitch first and learn to make this cute ski hat. You'll also find all of the information there that you need to choose your yarn and your needles, so if you're new to knitting, be sure to check that out. The reason that I love knit headbands in the winter is that they're perfect for when you're active outdoors, whether you're skiing, walking the dog, or shoveling snow. It's easy to get warmed up enough that you want to take your hat off, but you still need to keep your ears warm, especially if it's windy. Take it from me, frostbite is distinctly unflattering and absolutely no fun. This cute headband looks way better, and so you still look good even after you take it off. I've designed it so you won't wind up with ridges on your forehead like other headbands cause. Another great excuse to wear a knit headband is when you're watching winter sports, like the Women's National Curling Championships, which is where we are headed in just a few days. If you aren't familiar with the sport of curling, think of it as a combination of bowling, darts, billiards, and spring cleaning, with a little yoga tossed in for good measure, and all done on a solid sheet of ice. Those round things are called curling rocks because they're made out of, well, rock. 44 pounds of granite to be precise. Unless you are knitting lace, which you'll see in a future tutorial, there are really only two stitches used in knitting and purling. As I mentioned, the purl stitch is actually the reverse of the knit stitch. So by combining the two, you can make a huge variety of useful and beautiful stitch patterns, like the chevrons in this knit headband. That is because the front and the back of the stitches in knitting look very different. For instance, if you have all knit stitches facing you, it looks like this. But if you flip it over so that the back of the knit stitch is facing you, it looks like this. This is called stockinette. Notice how it rolls up at the bottom. This may not be what you want in a sweater, but it's actually what forms the brim of this pert little hat in my knitting tutorial, so be sure to check that out. As you knit back and forth, the front of the knit stitch alternates sides of your project, so you'll see a row of the front of the stitch followed by a row of the back side of the stitch. And because the purl stitch is the reverse of the knit stitch, essentially what you see is the knit side of the stitch alternating with the purl side of the stitch. The result is called the garter stitch pattern. But if you alternate the knit and purl side of the stitch in columns rather than in rows, you get the rib stitch pattern. I'm sure that it looks very familiar since it is commonly used on the hems and cuffs of sweaters. It is very stretchy, and unlike stockinette, it doesn't roll up at the bottom, which is why it's so popular. As I mentioned before, the two main stitches in knitting are the knit and the purl. So stockinette, garter, and rib are actually knit stitch patterns, not types of stitches. Knitters just shorthand it to rib stitch. We've seen what happens when we alternate rows of knit and purl and columns of knit and purl, but what about other patterns? Here we can see an example of the seed stitch, which alternates knit, purl, knit in one row with purl, knit, purl in the next row. And here in the headband, you can see that we have chevrons made by 4 knit stitches followed by 4 purl stitches. And the same thing happens in the next row and the next. The pattern just gets shifted over by 1 stitch with each subsequent row. So let's talk about what materials you'll need for this project. This is a great project for using up leftover yarn. I'm using this Lion brand Heartland yarn that's left over from a toque that I made for my father in my previous knitting tutorial. I'll link to all of the materials down in the description box down below. You can use any yarn that you would like, which is why I'm going to show you a quick way to calculate your gauge. You will need a 16-inch circular needle. I really like the Addi Turbo needles. They're a little bit more expensive, but they are worth every penny. Circular needles are much superior to traditional straight needles. And of course, you can also knit back and forth on them, so you aren't limited to projects that are knit in the round, but you can't knit in the round on a regular straight needle. So what do I mean by knitting in the round? Just what it sounds like. We're going to go around and around and around in a circle instead of back and forth, which is perfect for headbands and hats, though you can use it for sweaters, sleeves, socks, and a host of other projects. So back to our needles. What diameter needle are you going to need? The diameter of your needle is determined in large part by the size of the yarn that you're going to use, in part by what you're making, and in part by how you yourself knit. The label on your skein of yarn will give you a standardized yarn weight in both a number, here it's a number 4 weight, and a standardized description. This is a medium weight. The skein will also recommend a needle size. If you're like me and are using up yarn from a previous project, you may have lost the original label. Here's a quick chart giving different yarn weights and the recommended needle sizes in metric, US sizes, and UK sizes. There are both lighter weight yarns, 0 or lace weight, and heavier yarns up to number 7 or jumbo, but they aren't really suitable for this project. You are also going to need 3 knitting markers. I really like these flexible, openable ones from Boy, but you can also use round crafting rings or even colored paper clips. Just make sure that your paper clips are plastic covered so they don't damage your needles. You'll need 3 markers in total, and one should be distinguishable from the others, which you can do by using different colors or marking one, anything that you need just to tell it from the others. You will also need a measuring tape or ruler, a tapestry needle with an eye that is large enough to accommodate your yarn, and a pair of scissors. We're going to start out by determining our gauge, which is the number of stitches at a particular length of knitting, usually 4 inches or 10 centimeters. Checking your gauge is important for a number of reasons. For example, if you're knitting a sweater using a number 4 medium weight yarn, the pattern might call for 80 stitches across the back of the sweater so that it will be 20 inches wide. That's based on a gauge of 16-inch stitches over 4 inches. But what if you personally knit more tightly, say at 17 stitches over 4 inches? That may not seem like a big deal, but it means that the back of your sweater could be 1 1/4 inches too small. Since the front of the sweater would also be 80 stitches, overall your sweater could be 2.5 inches too small. The difference may seem indetectable. In fact, you probably didn't notice that the section of knitting above the tape measure is 16 stitches to the inch, and the section below is 17 stitches to the inch. But it can sure make a difference in your finished project. There are a couple of ways to adjust your gauge. The simplest is just to use a slightly larger or smaller needle. Another reason to find your gauge, and the one that I personally use the most, is when I'm just winging it. For instance, I have these 3 incredible books by Barbara Walker. I could look at them all day. Every one of them is filled with amazing stitch patterns, page after page. You can choose a stitch pattern, or 2, or half a dozen, and choose a yarn, and make a unique sweater, or just about anything else. For instance, on page 21 of the first book is the stitch pattern that she calls horizontal parallelogram check. If you compare it to the pattern I used for the headband, you can see where I got the idea. She uses a knit 5, purl 5 pattern, whereas I used a knit 4, purl 4 pattern, and halfway up I switched and went back in the other direction. See how much fun you can have? Checking your gauge means that you can use a slightly different yarn than the pattern calls for. And if you ever get hooked on yarn shops, which is pretty much inevitable if you knit, Then you'll frequently find that you start by falling in love with a yarn and then looking for a pattern you can use it with. That's what I did with this sweater. I fell in love with the yarn and then used the basket cable on page 274 to make it. The part on either side of the cable is done with the reverse side of the stockinette stitch showing to make a cable pop a little bit more. And here is a little lace sample that I made. This is the first time I ever tried knitting lace. I used an incredibly soft merino silk blend yarn for this English mesh lace pattern from page 193 of the first book, with a border of feather and fan, which is a really classic lace pattern found on page 205. A little promo for my upcoming tutorial. Feather and fan is the pattern I'll be teaching you in my tutorial on knitting lace. I want to draw your attention to her moss-bordered diamonds pattern on page 37. This looks like a really complex pattern, but it actually isn't. If you look closely, you'll see that the zigzag lines in between the diamonds are done with the purl side of the stitch. And the diamonds in the center are done with the knit side of the stitch facing you. And then the dotted borders around each diamond are done with a variation on the seed stitch that I showed you at the beginning. So once you finish this tutorial, you'll know everything you need to know in order to make a really, really impressive, but basically pretty simple stitch pattern like this. So I'll show you how to find your gauge so we can figure out how many stitches you will need to make our headband with your yarn based on the way you knit. We'll start out by knitting a 5 by 5 inch, that's 12.5 centimeter by 12.5 centimeter square. I said that gauge is checked over a 4 by 4 inch square, but we're going to leave a little extra around the edges to make sure that we're calculating our gauge right. It doesn't take that much longer to knit, and it's much, much less time consuming to try and make a slightly larger square than to find out that your project is the wrong size and have to rip it all out and redo it again. Gauge is normally checked using the stockinette stitch. If you are conjuring a new pattern from scratch like I did with the lace, of course you'll want to use whatever stitch you've chosen, but the gauge given on yarn labels and in most patterns are based on stockinette. If you have your label, then check the number of stitches it indicates for a 4 by 4 inch swatch and cast on that number plus about 25%, so we have a square about 5 by 5 inches. If you don't have your label, don't panic. Let's look again at the chart that I showed you earlier with the yarn weights. For size comparison, the Canadian penny at the bottom is the same size as an American penny, or slightly larger than a €1 coin. For superfine or number 1 yarn, cast on 40 stitches. For a fine, number 2 yarn, cast on 30. For light, cast on 25. For medium, cast on 20. And for bulky, cast on 16. This is a tutorial on the purl stitch, but we're going to just knit our first 3 or 4 rows, so we'll wind up with garter stitch. Remember, that's what happens when the front of the stitch is always facing you. That will give you just a little bit more to hang on to and make it easier for you as you learn the purl stitch. If you need a quick refresher either on casting on or on doing the knit stitch, you can hop on over to my tutorial on knitting. In that tutorial, I showed you 2 styles of knitting, English and Continental. I'll do the same thing with the purl stitch. I'll show you a couple of rows of purling using the English method, and then a couple of rows of purling using the Continental. You may use whichever method you are comfortable with, both for the knit and the purl rows. Then we will just keep alternating knit and purl rows, which, remember, gives us the stockinette pattern until we have our 5 by 5 swatch. That will give you plenty of time to get the hang of the purl stitch before we start our headband. If at any point in the video you find that things are going too fast for you, I have a quick 2-minute tutorial on how to adjust the speed of your YouTube video that you may find helpful. I'll link it in the upper right-hand corner of the screen and in the description box down below. That tutorial also shows you how to flip the video over to a mirror image so that if you are left-handed, you'll find it much easier to follow. You can go ahead and pause this video until you have 3 or 4 rows of stitches done, and I'll catch up with you then. I'm going to start this row with just a few knit stitches so that you can look again closely at what I'm doing and then compare it to how I form the purl stitch. I'm going to freeze it right here because there are a couple of things I want you to notice. The first is the position of the yarn. The yarn is coming out from the back of the work. The other thing I want you to notice is where the point of my needle is. It is going from the front to the back of the yarn in the stitch I'm about to make. So let's compare that now to this purl stitch I'm about to make. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the yarn around so it's coming off the front of the project, and then I am going to stick my needle through from the back to the front. So in knitting we go from the front to the back, in purling we go from the back to the front. And then we pull the stitch through like we would in knitting. As you watch this next stitch, notice that I don't bring the yarn around to the front of the work again. It's already there. That's just done when you're switching from knitting to purling, because on knitting, your yarn is coming off the back of the work, and in purling, it's coming off the front. So if you're staying with one stitch, like you are here, then you don't need to change the location of your yarn. If you're switching from knitting to purling, or purling to knitting, for instance, if you're doing a rib, then you'll need to switch from one side of the work to the other. Okay, and when we get to the end of the row, we're going to flip it around, and on the way back, we're going to do a knit stitch all the way across. So once that's done, I'll catch up with you again. So here we are to the end of our knit row, and I'd like you to take a moment just to notice the difference between the last 3 rows where we did a knit, a purl, and a knit, and the previous rows where we did all knit. And that's the distinction between the stockinette, which is above, and the garter stitch, which is down below. Now, as we turn it around and start going back the other direction, I'm going to show you how to purl using the Continental method this time. My yarn is still coming off the front of the work. I'm holding it in my left hand, but still coming off the front of the work. So regardless of whether you are knitting Continental or you are knitting English style, if you are doing a purl, your yarn is going to be in front of your work and you're going to bring your needle in from the back. Conversely, if you're knitting, you're going to have your yarn at the back of your work and you're going to be putting your needle through from the front. But regardless of whether you hold your yarn in your left hand or your right, forming the purl stitch in Continental style is very similar to forming it in the English style. Needle in from the back, pull the yarn through. And once again, I'm going to leave you here and I will rejoin you after we finish our squares. And we're back. You can see that it's a good thing that I made my swatch 5 inches by 5 inches because it came up a little bit short. So if I'd made it 4 inches by 4 inches, it really would have been too small. You don't need to worry about casting off. You can just unravel it and use it again for another project or even for this one. So now lay your swatch flat on a table and measure out 4 inches and count the number of stitches that you have there. If you have partial stitches, then round up or down. Okay, now it's time to break out the chalkboard for a little more math. Don't get intimidated. This is easy. The first thing we need to figure out is how long our headband needs to be. For instance, if it's made for a child or a teen rather than an adult, that will make a difference. If you have the person handy, then measure around their head just above their ears. Yes, the headband will need to fit over their ears too, but this way it won't be too loose. If the recipient isn't available, perhaps you're making this for a gift, then here are some general guidelines. Remember that our gauge is based on 4 inches or 10 centimeters, so we need to divide our head size by 4 or 10 if you're using metric. If I'm making it for myself, I'll make it about 22 inches. 22 divided by 4 is 5.5. Let's call that number the repeats. Now I need to know how many stitches. I'll take my gauge and multiply it by the number of repeats. Say my gauge is 16 stitches over 4 inches. I'll multiply my gauge by my repeats. In my example, that would be 16 times 5.5, so I need 88 stitches. 88 stitches will give me a 22-inch headband. Now I'm going to introduce a little twist that is specific to this headband. Because we want a continuous line of chevron motifs all the way around our headband, we need to make sure that the number of stitches is divisible by 8. That's because the full chevron motif is 4 knits followed by 4 purls, so 8 stitches. If we don't make sure we have the number that's divisible by 8, then things will get all messed up as we go around. So now you will divide your number of stitches by 8, and then ignore everything to the right of the decimal point. Then multiply the number left of the decimal point times 8. That's the number of stitches you would actually cast on. If that seems confusing, let's try a couple of examples. I calculated 88 stitches for my 22-inch headband. 88 divided by 8 is 11.00. So my number is divisible by 8. Yay! But what if I had calculated that I needed 84 stitches to make my headband? When I divide that by 8, I get 10.5. That's 10.5 motifs. But that won't work. It'll look wrong. So I'll drop the 0.5, and then I have 10 full motifs that will fit on my headband. Then I multiply my 10 motifs by the 8 stitches in each motif, and I get 80 stitches. So that's the number of stitches that I would cast on. For this project, if I have partial motifs, like my 10.5, then I want to round down, not up, to make a full motif. That's because it's okay if this headband's a little snug, but it's no use if it keeps falling down over your eyes. If we were making a sweater, then you would be better to round up so the sweater wouldn't be too tight. See how easy that was? You can do that with anything. The width of a scarf, the width of a sweater. You're on your way to make just about anything you want to. But let's finish our headband first. Go ahead and cast on the number of stitches that we've calculated, and I'll catch up with you once that's done. Now we have just a tiny bit more math. We're going to divide your headband into 3 sections. That's because we're going to make the inside part of the front with stockinette stitch so it won't leave ridges on their forehead like rib stitch sometimes does. The rest of the inside of the headband will be in rib stitch so that it's nice and stretchy. I'm going to show you this on our finished headband. Hopefully it'll make more sense that way. I'm going to use pins instead of knitting markers. To figure out how wide your stockinette section should be, divide your number of cast-on stitches by 3. If it doesn't come out even, no worries, just round down. In my case, 88 divided by 3 is 29.3333 stitches, so I'll just use 29. We could just count that off from where we start and finish a row, but that part of the headband sometimes doesn't look as tidy as the rest, so we don't want it to show. So we're going to put it at the back. We want to center our stockinette section across from that, so we need to find the center of the front. We do that by dividing the total number of stitches, in my case 88, by 2. So for me, that's 44 stitches. I'll count 44 stitches from the beginning, and I'm going to use my knitting marker that doesn't match the others, just temporarily. Now we've found where we want the middle of our stockinette section to be, and we know how many stitches we want it to be. Now we just have to figure out how many stitches to put on either side of the marker so that it's centered. We'll divide the width of our stockinette section in half. My stockinette section is supposed to be 29 stitches wide. Divided by 2, that comes out to 14.5. So I can either do 14 or 15 stitches on either side. It doesn't matter. I will count over 15 stitches from that center marker in each direction, and I'll use my 2 identical markers to mark those places. Now I'm going to take that different marker in the center and move it back to where each new row begins. You'll be able to tell where that is because you'll see a little tail of yarn. Now my headband is divided into 3 equal, or close enough, sections. Once you have your markers on, before you start your first row, it's really important to make sure that your yarn isn't twisted on your needles. Take a few extra seconds. I find that facing the bottom part of your cast on toward the center of the circular needle usually works best. If it's twisted, then your entire headband will be twisted and you'll have to rip it out and redo it. Here I've slipped on my knitting marker. I'll do that as I go along, but you already have that taken care of. I wanted you to be able to focus on your stitches because the first row is always a little tricky. It's going to be even trickier this time because we're going to start out with the rib stitch right off the bat. Just take your time. If you drop a cast on stitch before you get it knit or purled, there's a solution, and I'll show that to you in a couple of minutes. If you get absolutely totally frustrated and want to give up, don't. It's best to start with the rib right off the bat, but if you find that it's just too awkward and need more to hold on to, go ahead and do 1 round of plain knitting and then start your ribbing. I mentioned that in knit, the yarn is at the back and your needle goes in the front, and in purl, it's the other way around. Yes, that means that you'll have to move your yarn from the front to the back each time you change from knit to purl and back again. That's what makes rib knit so stretchy, but it also makes it slow to knit. Another good reason for that stockinette section at the front. Just be patient. Your speed will naturally pick up as you get more comfortable with the stitch. So let's zoom in on what I'm doing for a moment. Yarn at the back of the work, needle from the front, knit the stitch. Change the yarn to the front of the work, needle from the back, purl the stitch. Change the yarn to the back of the work, knit the stitch. I apologize. I automatically dropped into doing Continental Stitch here, but the principle is the same for knitting English style. You'll use your index finger to move the yarn from front to back and back to front again, just like you would when you're making the actual stitch. Here's what to do if one of your cast-on stitches slips off the needle before you get the stitch made. Here I'm slipping the stitch off deliberately to show you, and you can see that it leaves a lot more space. So just wrap that around your finger again, and then tuck it back onto your needle. And then, you guessed it, keep on knitting. So, how long do we keep on knitting? We're going to knit around till we get to our first marker, a third of the way around, and I'll catch up with you then. We are to our next marker. So now we're going to put our yarn behind the work, if it isn't already there, and then we're going to put the needle in from the front to form a knit stitch. We're going to keep doing knit stitch until we get to our next marker, and then we'll switch back to alternating knit and purl to make ribbing again. We'll keep doing ribbing until we get to the marker at the back of the headband, at the beginning of our row. Remember, that's the one that's a different color. And then I'll catch up with you when we get there. Congratulations, you finished your first row. That one is always the hardest, so good on you. What do we do when we get to this point? We just keep on knitting rib. Always keep on knitting. That's my new mantra. We'll keep on knitting rib until we get to the marker at the beginning of our stockinette section, and then we'll switch to knitting until the next marker, etc. How many rows should you keep on knitting for? It depends on your gauge again. A good headband is about 3 inches or 7.5 centimeters wide or thereabouts. That's large enough to cover most people's ears. If you're making it for a tween or a child, then go a little narrower. We are going to put the seam of our headband around the middle of the inside so there aren't any funky looking bits showing on the outside where we made the seam. So we're going to knit our rib and stockinette combination until we have half the width that you've decided you want your headband to be, around 1.5 inches or 3.25 centimeters. We'll stop at the marker at the beginning that is different from the others, and I'll catch up with you again there. We now have the back half of our headband, so we're going to start working on the front, where the pattern will be. We're going to start out by doing one entire row of purl, all the way around. That'll create a bit of a crease that forms a nice defined edge at the front of our pattern. You can see that here, and in this little snippet from a few rows further on shows how that row of purl helps to create that crease. I'll catch up with you once we've reached that point. Okay, now we have our row of purl. So now we're going to do 2 rows of knit stitch. It'll look like stockinette to sort of set off our chevron from the rest of the headband. I'll catch up with you once that's done. And now we have our 2 rows of knit plus our 1 row of purl. And as I showed you before, you can really start to see that fold or that crease developing. Now we are ready to start our chevron. As we talked about back when we were figuring out how many stitches to cast on, our pattern is a repeat of 4 knit stitches followed by 4 purl stitches, all the way around. So that's what we're going to do now. We'll see you then. Okay, now we're on our second row of our chevron. This is where it really starts to form. If we just kept doing knit 4, purl 4 on every row, then we'd wind up with straight up and down stripes instead of chevrons. The way we get the chevron is by offsetting our pattern by 1 stitch with each row. So to start this row, we're going to do 1 purl stitch, and then we'll start our knit 4, purl 4. When we get to the end of the row, we'll wind up purling 3 stitches to account for the one that we put at the beginning of our row. So we'll see you then. We are now at the end of our second row of chevrons. You can see here that we ended with 3 purls, but added to the 1 purl at the beginning of the row, we still have the knit 4, purl 4 repeat. With this row, we're going to offset it by 1 stitch again. So we'll start with 2 purl stitches, knit 4, purl 4, and then end with 2 purl stitches. After that, we'll start with 3 purls, knit 4, purl 4, and end with 1 purl stitch. Our row after that will start with 4 purls and end with 4 knits. So I'll catch up with you when we get to that point. You now have 4 rows. You should be able to see the motif starting to take shape. Now is a good time to check and make sure that you don't have any stitches in odd places, knits where you should have purled or vice versa. If you do, don't despair, you won't have to rip it all out and redo it. In my previous knitting tutorial, I have a section on how to repair a dropped stitch, and you can use the same technique to correct an incorrect stitch. By now you know that we are just going to keep on knitting. The question is, how far? Once again, that depends on your gauge. Count the number of rows that you made in your ribbing. That's the halfway point of the back of your headband, so it will be the same number of rows to the halfway point of the front of your headband, which is where the point of the chevron will happen. Don't count our purl row that made the crease, but do count the 2 stockinette rows that we did before we started the chevrons. In my case, I had 9 stitches in my ribbing, so I need 7 rows of my chevron pattern plus the 2 stockinette rows. So, keep on knitting to that point, and then I'll show you what we do next. Now we're going to start our chevron going back in the other direction. Take the number of extra stitches that you did at the beginning of your last row, knit or purl, it doesn't matter what kind or how many, and subtract 1. If I did 2 purls at the beginning of the last row, I want to do just 1 at the beginning of this row before I start my knit 4, purl 4. Then in the next row, I'll subtract 1 again and start with a knit stitch. Keep subtracting 1 stitch, just like you kept adding 1 on the way up. You can see what the result is. Your chevrons start going back in the other direction. then keep on knitting. How long? So you have 1 fewer rows than you did on the way up. For instance, I did 7 rows of chevron pattern to get to this point, so I'm going to do 6 more on the way back in the other direction. That way your chevron will come out even. Otherwise, one side of your arrow would be longer than the other. And once again, I'll catch up with you when we get to that point. Okay, we have our chevrons finished. Yay! Now is the time to go back and count and make sure that you have the right number of rows. It's all cruising from here on in. We're going to mirror what we did in the previous section. We'll do 2 rows of knit stitch, 1 row of purl stitch, and then as many rows of rib and stockinette as you did in the first half. Don't forget to put your markers back on so you won't forget the stockinette section at the front. Once we get to that point, I'll show you how to cast off so that your ribbing stays stretchy. See you then! Okay, we're ready to start casting off. We're going to be using 2 different ways of casting off. The normal, everyday, easy cast off that we use for your stockinette, garter, etc. And then a stretchier one that we're going to use for rib. Just like rib is a more complicated version of stockinette or garter, the rib cast off is more complicated too. Not harder, just more steps. So I'm going to show you a basic cast off first. We won't use it until we get to the stockinette sections, so you don't have to follow along. I just want you to see the process. That will make it much easier to understand what we're up to when we actually start doing the rib cast off. I'm just going to show you by casting off on our little gauge swatch that I made at the beginning. I'm using the English style here, but I'll show you the Continental when we get there too, so you can choose which one you prefer. So we start by just doing a normal knit stitch. Easy. Now we're going to knit the next stitch as well. And then we're going to take our needle and lift the first stitch that we made up and over the second one. So we've cast off that first stitch. Simple. I'll show you a couple more times and then we'll jump into the rib cast off. The reason that we're using 2 different cast off techniques is because rib is much stretchier. So we don't want to use a cast off that reduces that stretch or our headband won't be stretchy and all that time doing knit 1, purl 1 would have gone to waste. Here I've done a section of rib cast off on the right next to the normal cast off on the left. Even though they're both on stockinette, you can see how much stretchier the rib cast off is. I'm going to show you how to do the rib cast off in English style on this swatch, and then I'll show you the Continental version on the actual headband. Having done it both ways, I think that the English style may be a little easier. The first stitch is just a knit like we did with the regular cast off. Now we're going to make a loop by wrapping the yarn around the needle before we make that second knit stitch. Now we're going to take the left needle and reach past the knit stitch we just made to pick up the loop and pull it up and over the stitch. Then we reach over and get the first stitch that we made and lift it up and over too. So the difference with the rib cast off is that loop in between. I'll show you that again. Yarn around the needle, make the stitch, grab the loop, up and over, grab the previous stitch, up and over. Yarn around the needle, make the knit stitch, grab the loop, up and over, grab the previous stitch, up and over. Again. Yarn around, knit the stitch, grab the loop, up and over, grab the previous stitch, up and over. The only frustrating thing about the stitch is that sometimes that loop slips off the needle before you get the knit stitch made. It seemed to be less prone to do that when I was using the English style, but here's a quick look at the Continental. Same procedure. Yarn around to make the loop, knit the stitch, up and over again. Again, make the loop, knit the stitch, up and over again. We'll keep doing this until we get around to the marker that starts our stockinette section, and then we'll go to the other cast off, which looks super easy in comparison. And we're ready to cast off the stockinette section. As I was editing, I realized that I bumped the camera and you couldn't see what I was doing, so I refilmed it using the gauge swatch. So I'll walk you through that again. Start out by making the knit stitch, make a second stitch, lift the first stitch up over the second one. And then again, make another stitch, lift the previous stitch up and over. And here's a look at doing it Continental style. When we get around to the rib section again, of course, we'll go back to the rib cast off. Just keep on knitting. I'll catch up with you again when we get to the last stitch, and I'll show you how to finish off your project. Okay, we've done our last rib cast off, and we're left with that final stitch on our needle. Just snip off the end of your yarn, give yourself a couple of extra inches, and then pull the end of the yarn through the loop and pull it snug. You can either do that with the needle or just with your fingers. I'm going to use this orange yarn to sew my headband together so you can see what we're doing, but of course you'll use your original color yarn. We could just use a normal overhand stitch to sew the two sides of our headband together, but that might leave us with a ridge around the middle, and once again we'd be left with that old lines on the forehead issue. So we're going to stitch our two sides together so that it will be smoother. Once again, we're going to use one technique on the stockinette and a slightly different one on the ribbing. You'll need to trim off a length of yarn to sew with. A little over a foot will be good. You don't want it too long or it will just get tangled. You'll also need a needle with an eye that is large enough to accommodate your yarn. We need to make sure that we're sewing the headband right way out and also lining it up properly. Since we have chevrons on both sides and ribbing on both sides, we want to make sure that those rows of purl stitch that we did on either side of the designs are on the outside, and that gives us our nice crisp crease. And once again, the rib is going to be a little more complex than the stockinette, so we'll start with stitching the stockinette. That also makes it really easy to line up with the two sides of our headband. Okay, thread up your needle and let's get started. Line up your two sides so that the stockinette starts in the same place. We'll start by pulling a single stitch through and then tying a half knot. Leave a tail so you can sew it back in later. Like with the cast-offs, it may be easier to watch me make the first few stitches so that it becomes clearer what I'm doing before you start in on it yourself. The stitches themselves are really simple. The critical thing is just that we want to make sure that we're lining everything up so that your first stockinette stitch on the one side lines up with the first stockinette stitch on the other side, etc. We also want to make sure that we're working the stitch closest to the edge so that our headband won't bunch up where we sewed it together. I'm actually going to start showing you this a few stitches in so you can see the pattern forming. It will help you to understand what I'm doing. Remember how at the beginning of this tutorial I pointed out that each of the knit stitches looks like a little V? All our little V's are lying on their sides now, but the shape is still evident. So I'm going to take my needle behind the little V on the right, not just half the letter, the whole V, and pull that through. Now I'm going to do that with the first V on the other side. The V's are a little more defined on our right side, which is where we cast off, than on the left side with our original cast-ons. So make sure you get the very bottom stitch on the left. Pull that through. Back to the right. Behind the V, pull through. You'll see that as we repeat this, we really wind up with what looks like little knit stitches on their sides all the way along. That gives us a nice smooth finish to the inside of our headband. Go ahead and keep this up until you get to the rib section of your headband, and I'll catch up with you then and show you the little twists that we have on the ribbing. Now you can see what a beautiful smooth finish that gives us to the inside of our headband. It also still maintains the stretchiness of the stockinette. Now we'll tackle our ribbing. The same principle will apply to the ribbing, but because we have alternate rows of purl and knit, we don't always have those little V's. But in some ways, the ribbing is easier because it is easy to make sure that you line up properly. First, we'll start by going behind the purl stitch on the right. Then the purl stitch on the left. Then the V of the knit stitch on the right, and the V of the knit stitch on the left, and so on. There are some more complex ways to join two sections of ribbing, but I don't think that they are necessary here. Just remember to keep your stitches loose enough to ensure that your ribbing doesn't lose its stretchiness. Stop every few inches, especially at the beginning, to pull on the part of the ribbing that you've just stitched and make sure that it stays stretchy. Soon you'll get a feel for what is just the right amount of tension. Once you've stitched it all together, just go ahead and sew in the ends of your yarn so that it looks nice and tidy. And there we have it, our finished headband. Congratulations! You've mastered a lot of great skills in this tutorial. You've learned how to do the purl stitch, and how to cast off, and how to do the finishing touches, and how to check your gauge, and design your own knitting pattern. Wow! And that's it, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. If so, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. You can find the pattern for this headband on my website at silverriverarts.com. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll know when my next video goes up. We'll see you then.